Can maybe start off with a sort of a broader perspective when it comes to youth participation in politics. It's safe to just highlight that Africa's youth demographic is significant. This is a critical component of the population that must be involved in decision making, in politics, in development. But there's also a very concerning trend, which is not only peculiar to Zimbabwe, and it's what people call the voter apathy, where in general, a significant number of young people does not show up when it comes to election. Another interesting component to young people's participation is the uprise of alternative methods of participating, where we might say, okay, we're not seeing them enough at the polls, but these are people that are also championing their causes through various or innovative ways, such as social media. We've seen hashtags such as Zimbabwean Lives Matter. So I think we're seeing these very interesting dynamics in terms of, is it that young people are not participating, or it's that they've created forms of participation that they think might be more meaningful compared to going to the polls.
Do these alternative means that you just highlighted, social media, etc., matter when it comes down to the ballot itself? Because you need to cast your vote.
I think you respond to your question in part there when you say you need to cast your vote. What we see from Nigeria's example is that these methods are not just either or, they can actually be complementary. So yes, protest on Twitter, start a hashtag, but you also need to complement it with actually going to the polls, because this is where it matters. This is where decisions are made, and this is the formal method of participation. So I think there is no one method that can suffice on its own, but it's important to complement the different approaches in order to make our political and development landscape more inclusive, particularly when it comes to women and when it comes to young people themselves.
All right.
That's an interesting one, because the trends are quite interesting. I think especially if you look at countries like Niger, Mali, where we see the emergence of Burkina as well, Burkina. So I think it's very interesting, but also concerning trends that we're seeing across the continent, which are unconstitutional changes of government, or as other people would call it, military coups. And I think one of the things that we need to note when it comes to these unconstitutional changes of governments is the amount of citizen support that is going to military regimes. Why are people supporting military coups so much? And this is more evident in the West Africa region. And what that highlights is actually sort of a gap in terms of leadership, or a leadership crisis, where people feel institutions like the military, they're not designed to govern or to lead, but people will opt to say would rather have a military regime than to have an elected president. So I think that's one of the concerns that we should take note of, and that even governments themselves needs to take note of, so that they don't become a threat to themselves. People should not be made to feel that they do not have a stake in politics and governance, because when they don't have a stake, then military coups become a sort of an option for them, because that's one of the ways through which they can be hurt. We need to have young people that are engaged in these matters, that don't just sit at home and say, I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to participate because I don't feel represented. But to go a step further and say, I think let's push for 20%, I think let's push for 30%, I think that's something to work towards. And then maybe words of encouragement to everybody else, because we're going to be voting this week. I'll refer to the words of Frantz Fanon, who says, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill or betrayed. So I think the mission of young people is not always given. It's not always clear. The government is not going to come and say, we're going to give you 20% or 30%. We actually need to work together as young people. We need to coordinate our efforts in order to make our voices heard. Maybe not for ourselves, but maybe for youth that are going to come in 10 years' time. They'll be able to say, because Karen advocated for 30%, now we have 30% of young people represented in decision making.
All right, let me hold you there. It looks like
and I think one of the interesting developments within the AU's mission or delegation, if you compare it today and compare it to the delegation which was sent to the previous elections, actually there's representation of young people there. And I think that is a sign to young people in Zimbabwe themselves that says things on the international agenda are changing. institutions, including the United Nations, the African Union, are increasingly appreciating the role that young people are playing. And I think that's where issues around partnership come in, even for young people that have outcries like what Tapio mentioned. That's a developing trend that young people in Zimbabwe can also capitalize on. I will share, it might be discouraging, but I think one of the particular challenges of the African Union is that it's an organization that is made up of the governing parties. And I won't shy away from speaking honestly about this, because this is where we exchange ideas as young people. So it then becomes difficult for, let's say, President Ramaphosa to sit down, Zimbabwe's president, and say, I think we could do things differently. So I think the African Union as an institution needs to move towards honest conversations about what's happening in our countries. This is not just to make the Zimbabwean election credible, but to also even make itself as an institution credible, so that it's not seen as just a club where presidents go and they're not intentional about change. So I think those are my honest reflections on what the AU could do. We need to have honest conversations about what's happening in our countries, bearing in mind that developments that we see in the West Africa region, in Burkina, for instance, in Mali, if we are not very intentional about resolving the governance challenges we're having, it's a matter of time before we start again to speak of coups within the Southern Africa region. And then maybe to just wrap up, it is to commend young people in Zimbabwe like Tapiwa, like Karen, who say, we know the situation. We know, the reflections in terms of governance are not what we hope it to be. But these are young people that have persisted to say, I am going to observe elections. I'm going to be a local observer. I'm going to continuously advocate for youth inclusion. And I think ours is to mobilize and have more and more young people that have this perception. We're not going to wake up with a better Zimbabwe tomorrow if we don't contribute towards that ourselves. So young people that are disappointed in institutions, yes, but they don't give up and continuously work to reform institutions and make them credible, make them inclusive, and make them fit for purpose for future generations.
Thank you so much, Cynthia.